Hello YouTube, welcome back to Nutkin Farm. I'm actually starting this video inside the house because I've had a visit from our neighbouring peacocks who tend to come in and look inside the house and get curious as to what we do in here. These are peahens actually, not peacocks. The male bird doesn't come around so much at the moment. He sort of changes location a fair bit. Anyway, they're good birds to have around the place, partly because they kill snakes on sight. And while I am still yet to see a harmful snake here, I've seen one diamond python. We're completely harmless. It's nice to know that peacocks are around and that they kill snakes instinctively. It's a beautiful and cold morning here at the farm. I'll just head out and show you a little bit of the vista. You can call this the pretty part of the movie because I'll give you a warning now. This will probably be a longer than normal one. And even though I started the channel to keep relatives informed and to persuade friends I wasn't kidding them that I'd actually bought a farm, I have attracted a couple of macadamia enthusiasts to the channel, and this particular video is largely for them. And it does involve a discussion of varieties. So if you aren't interested in my previous videos where I've discussed exactly that kind of thing, probably best give this one a miss. Now, when it comes to macadamia varieties, the large part of early development was done in Hawaii, where, oh, there's a guinea fowl over there too. Large part of it was done in Hawaii, where a couple of people brought back macadamias from largely southern Queensland in the 1890s, and then they bred them in a couple of orchards in Hawaii, and that's where the new varieties then came from. Some of them got distributed in Australia, some South Africa, and that sort of thing. And you've heard me discuss them in previous videos as 246 and 344 and that sort of thing. And those numbers refer to essentially the order in which new varieties were named. But there's a difference between naming a variety and it actually coming into production, that is, getting released to farmers and allowed to be grown. So you can call varieties as being named, I suppose, or released, but then varieties have to be selected so in order to be sort of grown and released to the farms. So the first one to really be selected anywhere was the 246, and outside of New South Wales, it isn't really grown by anyone anymore. It's just largely a variety that is used to pollinate other orchards because it has a nice heavy flower, and it's been used a lot in breeding programs to create new varieties of tree. And I mean, I've just planted some 246s, but in reality, you know, what we're talking about is a variety that dates back to about 1935. And I can't think of another agricultural crop where they're still using varieties that are that old. Ordinarily, you improve them, you make new varieties, new hybrids, that sort of thing. Now, in Hawaii, they stopped the breeding program, which was done by the Hawaii Agricultural Experiment Station, or HAES. They stopped that breeding program in the 90s, and it was about that time that CSIRO started doing some fairly heavy work here in Australia to create some new varieties of macadamias. And right now, the Macadamia Society are promoting some new varieties that were bred in a program funded from the Macadamia Levy, which is a little charge that gets put on every kilo of macadamias that we growers sell. So they're promoting varieties G, J, R, and P. And we've really got to get our naming systems right because, you know, it just becomes completely confusing. Anyway, there's a lot of conservatism in the industry and a lot of conservatism from growers who obviously don't want to plant anything that won't do well for them. And this is a mistake that you could make that'll cost you for years, because it often takes 5 or 6 years for a crop to grow. And, and then it starts fruiting. But then if you've made a mistake, you're almost stuck with it unless you want to pull up the tree, wait another 6 years and start again. So you realise why farmers would want a sure thing before they put a tree in the ground. Having said that, we're still planting 246, and there's been some water under the bridge since then. Now, to complicate things further, they don't release varieties, they don't select varieties in the order in which they're grown. Some have obvious merit and get released very early, others don't. So 344, which is one of the earliest Hawaiian varieties, was in fact not released until 1971, and then brought to Australia after that and planted widely. It's now Australia's most grown variety. But it was released way after variety 660, which was released in the mid-50s. So the order of release and the number sort of is a little bit confusing. Add to that the additional confusion that not all varieties are released in every country. And the difficulty with that is that you can read international literature on which varieties do well and which ones don't. Obviously, there's some variation on which varieties do well in which country, and that's largely climatic related, soil related. Even within Australia, there's a lot of difference between how well varieties do in some states and how well they do in others. So, for example, two of the popular varieties in Australia, 816 and 849, were rejected in Hawaii where they were bred. The 849 was rejected because they thought the shell was too thin, and the 816 was rejected because of the number of sticktites, that is, the amount of crop that was left on the tree and refused to fall during harvest time. And yet they're two of the well-liked varieties here in Australia, and 849 in New South Wales does very well. So how did we test these varieties? Well, it usually relied on some pioneering macadamia farmers to bring in these varieties from Hawaii or other countries and experiment with them. Or, of course, like the Hidden Valley plantations in Australia, breed your own. And so they've bred the A varieties, the A4, A16, A38, A268, A203. One of the pioneers was a man called Ian McConaughey, who brought varieties in from Hawaii and trialled them on his farm at Wolvie, which is near Gympie. It's about 4 hours drive north of here in Rosebank. He, by the end of his testing, had over 80 varieties on his farm. It's still a productive farm, I'm told, and it produces a stack of nuts. But he trialled a lot of varieties and contributed his data to testing data. Now, he and the rest of the Australian industry were looking for what they call elite varieties. That is, varieties that were significantly better than what was already being grown. And I think, guessing the mood of the Australian farmers, they probably wouldn't take a punt on anything unless they knew it was significantly better than what they were doing. Now, MCT1, which I've got a trial plot of, is one of those candidate sort of elite varieties where it can almost certainly be proven that you will get higher production. They're trying to do the same with varieties G, J, R and P, but uptake so far has been slow. In any case, Ian brought in a lot of these varieties and started testing them. Some of them got selected in Australia, others didn't. Now, I've been through a lot of research lately because I've been looking for gap fillers in my orchard. I've got some gaps where new trees need to be planted. Most of the new varieties, though, have one thing in common. They drop their nuts much later than the existing varieties that people find in orchards. And maybe one of the reasons for slow uptake is that they want early dropping varieties to match the early dropping behaviour of the 246s and the 344s that everyone seems to have planted. And the new varieties don't cater for that. That theory would also explain why A203, which is actually an old variety that's just recently been latched onto, A203, which has an early dropping habit, is so popular because it is compatible with the existing orchards, and that some farmers don't want to be harvesting for 4 or 5 months of the year to cater for the dropping patterns of trees. So I went back and did some research on, well, which other varieties could drop their nuts early but have a productive capacity. And that's where I came across Ian's work, and I've since struck up a conversation with Ian, and he's pulled up his tests on what he did in the 80s with a couple of these varieties. One of them in particular jumped off the page, and that was variety 835. And I put out some test results here, which I'm hoping we can see on the camera. This was the results published by the Queensland Department of Agriculture on variety performance at Wolvie, which was where Ian's farm was. And if you like, you can pause the video and have a look at those statistics that you see. But bottom line is 835 came right in the middle of the pack of a bunch of known varieties there at the time in terms of the yield per tree, the sound kernel, but look at its statistics for first grade kernels, 99%, really high quality of kernel drop, and in particular whole kernels, 66.7%, so 2/3, and it's as high as 69% in other tests. That is a massive proportion of whole kernels coming out of the 835, particularly relative to other varieties that are commonly grown. Now, 849 is known to have a high percentage of whole kernels, but it's 55.9%. The new variety MCT1 is apparently clocking in at about 50% whole kernels. And the standard varieties, the 344 comes in at almost barely over 1/3 whole kernels. And whole kernels are valuable to nut processors. They can use them for chocolate coating, they can use them for the gift packs, they look more attractive to the customers, and, well, they're just plainly more versatile. Some other literature on 835, which was released in Hawaii, did some testing, and they dropped a lot of nuts from a 2-metre height, and the 835 nuts proved to be the most resilient of all. There was another test about oxidative stability, that is, one of the keeping qualities of nuts, where the 835 ended up being consistently high. So I scratched my head and I was wondering, look, why wasn't this 835 given a go? It just wasn't promoted to the industry. The Queensland Department of Agriculture did actually promote it a little. This was what they said about it, and again, you can pause the video if you want to read it in detail. But basically said, look, it's about 35-36% kernel recovery, 65 to 69% wholes, and at the bottom, which called out to me, an underrated variety with good overall performance and no major problems, worthy of further assessment. Now, this was at Wolvie, and Wolvie isn't the Northern Rivers, and varieties do perform differently in those different places. But I thought, wow, worthy of further assessment. It had had one trial in New South Wales, apparently, but the results were underwhelming. But the trial didn't go very long, and what the test data showed in Queensland was that 835 really got into its stride as a mature tree. It also, as you can see from this data, drops its nuts early and so is therefore compatible. It was an open pollinated seedling of 246. And a lot of our new varieties, including the 849, the 783, the 781, are in fact open pollinated varieties of 246. That is, they got a lot of nuts that had been randomly pollinated from 246, put them in the ground and saw what came up. We don't know what they pollinated with because it wasn't a deliberate cross. But 246 seems to have been good on that, and its offspring are all sort of generally spreading trees, somewhat susceptible to wind damage, but they flower well and they have a reasonable size nut. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Where could I get 835? And I hunted around, and it was an interesting hunt, that was for sure. So, moving on.